Before we delve into this story, please be aware that it explores themes of isolation, disturbing traditions, and unsettling mysteries. Viewer discretion is advised. The first thing you notice about Oakhaven isn't the oppressive humidity or the way the ancient cypress trees drip Spanish moss like forgotten tears. It's the silence. A silence so profound, so heavy it presses down on you, muffling not just sound but thought itself. It's the kind of silence that tells you secrets are kept here. Deep ones. I'm Sarah Jenkins, and I came to Oakhaven expecting a quaint story about forgotten Americana, a quiet escape from the relentless grind of city life, and the bitter taste of my last failed podcast. What I found instead was a place where the past isn't just history. It's a living, breathing, hungry entity. My beat-up SUV, affectionately named the Wanderer, had been crawling along the unpaved county road for what felt like an eternity, the gravel spitting like an angry cat under the tires. The GPS, bless its digital heart, had given up about 20 miles back, convinced I was driving into a swamp, and it wasn't entirely wrong. The landscape had dissolved into a tangled maze of waterways, dense forests, and ramshackle fishing shacks clinging precariously to the muddy banks. I was searching for Oakhaven, a town so small it barely registered on most maps, nestled deep in the forgotten corners of the American South. My assignment, a soft-focused piece on isolated communities and their enduring traditions, felt like a much-needed palate cleanser after the dark true crime rabbit holes I usually chased. I was supposed to find charm, resilience, perhaps a quirky local festival. Instead, the air grew thick with a different kind of story, one that felt less like folklore and more like a warning. I finally spotted the weathered wooden sign, half swallowed by kudzu. Welcome to Oakhaven, established 1842. Below it, in faded paint, was a curious addition. The river provides. The phrase, innocent enough on its face, sent a prickle of unease down my spine. The river, a wide, sluggish behemoth, seemed to wrap its muddy arms around the entire settlement, a dominant, almost sentient presence. Its surface, a dark mirror reflecting the bruised sky, looked less like a path and more like a barrier. Oakhaven itself was a collection of houses that looked like they'd been exhaled by the swamp and left to rot. Porches sagged, paint peeled like sunburnt skin, and the few windows I could see were either shuttered or dark, like vacant eyes. There were no children playing, no distant voices, no hum of traffic. Just that silence, punctuated by the buzz of unseen insects and the occasional splash from the river, too deep and heavy to be a fish. It felt less like a town and more like a stage set for a forgotten play, waiting for its actors to emerge from the shadows. My first stop was the general store, a listing structure that seemed to be held together by sheer stubbornness and the grace of ancient timber. As I pushed open the creaky screen door, a bell above chimed, its sound surprisingly clear in the oppressive quiet. The interior was dim, smelling of dust, molasses, and something vaguely metallic. Shelves were crammed with an eclectic mix of goods: fishing tackle, canned foods, faded fabrics, and curious, hand-carved wooden charms that looked like stylized fish or strange, squat figures. Behind a counter, a woman with a face like dried leather and eyes the color of river mud looked up from a tattered paperback. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. Her expression was utterly neutral, yet it held a depth that made me feel like I was being catalogued, understood, and perhaps dismissed. "Can I help you, stranger?" Her voice was a low rasp, like pebbles shifting in water. "Hi," I said, trying to infuse my voice with professional cheerfulness. "I'm Sarah Jenkins. I'm a podcaster, doing a story on isolated communities. I was hoping to learn a little about Oakhaven, its history, its people." Her gaze lingered on me, then drifted to my microphone, clipped conspicuously to my shirt collar. "Podcaster, huh? We don't get many of those round here. Don't get many folks at all, truth be told. Name's Martha." "It's a beautiful place, Martha," I offered, trying to break the ice. "Very peaceful." A flicker, almost imperceptible, crossed her face. "Peaceful, yes, if you know how to listen to the river. Not everyone does." I bought a bottle of water and a local map, more a hand-drawn sketch than an actual navigational tool. As I paid, I asked, "Are there any local figures I should talk to? Someone who knows a lot about Oakhaven's traditions." Martha paused, her hand hovering over the ancient cash register. "You could try David Miller. He runs the bait shop down by the old wharf. He knows a thing or two about the river. Or Michael Thorne, the sheriff, though he ain't much for talking to outsiders." She finally met my gaze, and for the first time I saw something beyond neutrality. A flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Caution. Pity. Just remember, Miss Jenkins, there are old ways here. Ways that ain't for everyone. And some things are best left undisturbed. Her words hung in the air. A subtle chill in the humid warmth of the store. It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but it felt like a heavy piece of advice, weighted with unspoken history. I thanked her and left, the screen door groaning shut behind me. The silence outside seemed even more profound after Martha's cryptic warning. My first impression of Oakhaven was one of profound insularity. The few people I saw, a man mending a net by the river, 2 women tending a small garden, offered no greetings, only quick, assessing glances before returning to their tasks. It was as if I were a ghost, or perhaps a disruption in a carefully maintained ecosystem. This wasn't the warm, welcoming small town I'd pitched to my producers. This was something else entirely. I found David Miller's bait shop, a slightly less dilapidated shack than the general store, tucked away near a rickety pier. David was younger than Martha, perhaps in his late 40s, with a perpetually worried frown etched between his brows. He was cleaning fish, the air thick with the smell of scales and river water. Unlike Martha, he actually managed a tight, almost apologetic smile when I introduced myself. Sarah Jenkins. Nice to meet you. Martha at the general store suggested I talk to you about Oakhaven and its history. He wiped his hands on a stained rag. History, huh? Not much to tell. Folks here just live by the river. Have for generations. He seemed hesitant, his eyes darting towards the murky water. The sign at the town entrance says, "The river provides," I prompted. What does that mean to the people here? David sighed, a long, weary sound. It means everything. The river gives us fish, transportation, keeps the world out. And it takes things too. He paused, his gaze fixed on a distant point on the water. Always has. Takes things. I pressed, sensing an opening. Like what? He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Sometimes it takes boats. Sometimes it takes people. Just last month, a young woman, Emily Roberts, went out on the river and never came back. Sheriff Thorne searched, but the river keeps its secrets, they say. My internal alarm bells, long dormant since my last intense investigation, began to clang. A missing person unrecovered. This was far from a quaint human interest story. Emily Roberts? What happened? Was it an accident? David shook his head slowly. Nobody saw anything. Her skiff was found, capsized, a few miles downstream. But she was just gone. Emily wasn't careless. She knew the river like her own shadow. She'd been on that water since she could walk. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a deep, quiet sorrow. Some folks say the river claimed her. That it was time for the river to be fed. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp, despite the oppressive heat. Fed? The phrase conjured images far darker than a simple drowning. Fed with what, David? What are you talking about? He looked away, his jaw tightening. Just old ways. Old stories. Don't much like to talk about them. Not with outsiders. He picked up another fish, his movements deliberate, a clear signal that the conversation was over. I pressed him a little more, but he became evasive, muttering about needing to finish his work. I could feel the wall going up, the same invisible barrier I'd encountered with Martha. It was clear I wouldn't get more from him, not yet. But the seed of a much bigger, much darker story had been planted. Emily Roberts, a young woman who knew the river intimately, simply vanishing, and the chilling local superstition that the river claimed her, fed by her disappearance. This wasn't just a missing persons case. It was a ghost story masquerading as a local tradition. As I walked back to my SUV, the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. The air grew heavier, the silence deeper, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The shadows stretched long and distorted, turning the gnarled cypress trees into monstrous figures. I looked out at the river, its surface now an inky black, reflecting nothing but the dim outline of the distant tree line. It no longer looked peaceful. It looked ancient, hungry, and utterly indifferent. My initial mission had been to find a story. Now a story had found me, and something told me that Oakhaven, with its old ways and its hungry river, wasn't going to let me leave until I had uncovered its darkest secrets. The chilling part? I wasn't sure I wanted to leave. Not yet. Not with Emily Roberts' ghost whispering from the depths. and the unsettling feeling that the river was indeed watching, waiting to see what I would do. My initial plan to pack up and leave that very morning dissolved like mist over the river. The more I thought about it, the more illogical it seemed. A journalist doesn't abandon a story just as it's beginning to show its teeth. And this wasn't just any story. This was a narrative woven from forgotten lives and whispered legends, a tapestry I felt compelled to unravel. The cabin, once a temporary refuge, began to feel like a strategic base. My camera gear, which had been neatly stowed, was now spread across the small dining table, lenses and microphones at the ready. This wasn't just a personal quest anymore. It was an investigation. My first step was to learn everything I could about Emily Roberts. The internet, usually a bottomless well of information, was surprisingly sparse. A few old news articles from a regional paper, dating back nearly 2 decades, confirmed the basics. A local girl vanished without a trace, presumed drowned in the river. No body ever found. No suspects, no motive, just a cold case gathering dust. The articles were brief, almost dismissive, as if the disappearance of a young woman from the remote river community was a common, almost inevitable occurrence. That struck me as odd. Every life holds value, every disappearance a tragedy. Why the lack of detail, the lack of outrage? I needed to talk to people. Real people, not just pixels on a screen. The nearest town, Havenwood, was a cluster of weathered buildings about a 15-minute drive down a winding gravel road. It consisted of a general store, a bait shop, a diner that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint since the 70s, and a handful of houses. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and outsiders were either tolerated or quietly observed. The general store, a creaking wooden structure with a porch that sagged in the middle, seemed like the logical starting point. A bell jingled above my head as I pushed open the heavy door, announcing my arrival to the cavernous, dimly lit interior. The air inside was thick with the scent of dust, old wood, and something vaguely metallic like rusted fishing lures. Shelves overflowed with everything from canned goods and fishing tackle to faded postcards and mismatched socks. Behind a counter piled high with penny candy and local newspapers sat an elderly woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes a startling shade of pale blue. She wore a hand-knitted shawl despite the mild weather, and her silver hair was pulled back in a tight bun. She didn't look up immediately, instead focusing on meticulously arranging a display of prepackaged beef jerky. "Can I help you, stranger?" Her voice was raspy like dry leaves skittering across pavement, but surprisingly strong. Her gaze, when it finally met mine, was direct and unwavering. Felt less like a question and more like a challenge. "Good morning," I said, trying for an agreeable, non-threatening tone. "My name is Michael. I'm renting the old Miller cabin upriver for a bit, just trying to get a feel for the area." I gestured vaguely. She simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "Miller's been empty for a long time. Folks usually don't stay long." "Oh, why's that?" I asked, feigning casual curiosity, though my pulse quickened slightly. She finally looked away, picking up a small, tarnished silver locket from beneath the counter and turning it over in her fingers. "The river," she said, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. "The river has its ways, and it doesn't much care for change." "The river," I repeated, trying to prompt her. "What about it?" She just shrugged, a slight lift of her thin shoulders. "It gives and it takes. Always has. Always will." She met my gaze again, her pale blue eyes seeming to bore into me. "You looking for something in particular, Michael?" This was my chance. Actually, yes. I was doing some research on local history, and I stumbled across an old news story about a young woman named Emily Roberts. Disappeared years ago. I was hoping perhaps someone might remember her. Or what happened. The air in the store seemed to grow colder. The woman's fingers tightened around the locket. Her face, which had been merely unreadable, now seemed to harden, turning to stone. "Emily Roberts," she said, the name a flat, lifeless pronouncement. "That was a long time ago. Best left alone. But surely someone remembers her? A family member? Friends?" She finally put the locket down, pushing it back under the counter with a definitive movement. "Some things are best not stirred up, young man. The river, it remembers, but it doesn't like to be reminded." She turned her back to me, beginning to wipe down the already clean counter with a damp cloth. The conversation was clearly over. I bought a bottle of water and a bag of local jerky, the transaction conducted in a strained silence. As I left, the bell jingled again, and I could feel her eyes on my back until I was out the door. The interaction left me with a profound sense of unease. It wasn't just reluctance. It was an active desire to shut down any inquiry into Emily Roberts. And the repeated references to the river, almost as if it were a living entity, were unsettling. Back at the cabin, the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees. The river, glinting through the foliage, seemed to pulse with a quiet energy. I pulled out my laptop, determined to find a different angle. If locals wouldn't talk, maybe there were records. Old property deeds, census data, anything that might connect Emily to the land, to a specific family line, to the old ways the shopkeeper hinted at. I spent hours sifting through digital archives, cross-referencing names and dates. It was tedious work, but eventually a pattern began to emerge. The names associated with the Miller cabin, the Roberts family, and several other families in the Havenwood area appeared repeatedly in historical records stretching back generations. They were all intertwined, marrying within the community, holding on to their land, rarely leaving. A tightly knit insular group, the river folk, as I was beginning to think of them. Among the records I found something curious. A series of land disputes from the late 19th century. Several families, including the Roberts, had been involved in bitter arguments over water rights and fishing territories. These weren't just legal battles. They were described in archived newspaper snippets as having deep-seated animosities and ancient grievances. Even then, the river was central to their conflicts. Then I found it. A small, almost illegible entry in a digitized church register from nearly a century ago. It mentioned a river blessing ceremony, performed annually by the local community. The entry was brief, but it spoke of offerings made to ensure the river's bounty and to appease its spirit. Appease its spirit. The phrase sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just superstition. It felt like a living tradition, a belief system that shaped their lives. My gaze drifted from the screen to the window. The river was a dark, shimmering ribbon, reflecting the deepening twilight. The cabin felt smaller, more isolated. The silence of the woods pressed in, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. I decided to take a walk. Fresh air, a chance to clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cooler now, carrying the damp, earthy scent of the river. The path winding down to the water's edge was barely visible in the fading light. As I walked, the faint murmur of the river grew louder. The trees formed a dense canopy overhead, their branches intertwining like gnarled fingers. It was profoundly quiet, almost eerily so. No distant traffic, no sounds of human activity. Just me, the trees, and the river. I reached the small rocky beach where I'd found the locket. The water lapped gently against the shore, a soft, rhythmic whisper. I shone my flashlight beam across the surface, watching the small ripples. That's when I saw it. Nestled between two smooth river stones, half submerged in the water, was a small, intricately carved wooden figure. It was crude, almost primitive in its design, but unmistakably a human form. It looked old, weathered, the wood darkened by years of exposure. As I reached down to pick it up, my fingers brushed against something else, something smooth and cool. It was another locket. Not the tarnished silver one I'd found earlier, but a smaller, simpler one made of dark, polished river stone, strung on a piece of frayed leather cord. Felt impossibly cold in my hand. I opened it, my heart pounding. Inside, etched into the stone, was a single faded initial. An Emily. My flashlight beam caught something else then, just at the edge of the water, partially covered by a tangle of reeds. A small faded patch of fabric. I knelt, pulling it free. It was a piece of a child's dress, a pale blue with tiny embroidered river lilies. It was old, brittle, and felt impossibly fragile in my hands. A child's dress. And a locket. The wooden figure. And what the old woman in the store had said. The river, it remembers. But it doesn't like to be reminded. A sudden chill, unrelated to the evening air, snaked its way up my spine. The river, which had seemed so benign moments ago, now felt vast and unknowable. Its dark surface reflecting not the stars, but something far older, far more mysterious. I clutched the locket and the fabric, my mind racing. These weren't just relics of the past. They were whispers direct from the depths. And they weren't just about Emily Roberts. They were about the river itself, and the secrets it guarded, secrets that were now beginning to surface unwillingly for me. I had come looking for a story, But I was beginning to suspect the story had been waiting for me all along, and it was far more personal and far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. My mind reeled, caught in a swirling eddy of dread and disbelief. Personal? Dangerous? The words echoed, each syllable a heavy stone dropped into the murky depths of my consciousness. I had arrived in Port Willow with a journalist's detached curiosity, a professional distance that felt miles away now. The river, once a picturesque backdrop, now seemed to pulse with an ancient, watchful energy, its secrets no longer whispered but pressing in on me, suffocatingly close. The immediate chilling realization was that if this story was personal, it meant I was not just an observer. I was a participant, perhaps even a target. The thought sent a jolt down my spine. What could possibly connect me, a city dweller with a seemingly ordinary family history, to the isolated, tradition-bound riverfolk of Port Willow? My family tree, as far as I knew it, was firmly rooted in suburban normalcy, generations removed from any remote, watery communities. Yet, the feeling persisted, a cold, undeniable certainty that had settled deep in my gut. I spent the next few days in a fog of restless apprehension, the vibrant hues of Port Willow dulled by a creeping anxiety. I tried to focus on the objective facts, to rationalize the unsettling sensation away. But every conversation felt charged. Every glance from a local seemed to hold a hidden meaning. The river itself, with its slow, deliberate current, felt like a silent ancient judge. The only way to confront this growing unease, I decided, was to lean into it. If the story was personal, then the answer had to lie within my own past. It was a long shot, a desperate attempt to find a link, any link however tenuous. I started with what I had. Old family photographs I'd brought with me, a few faded letters from my grandmother, Eleanor, and a tattered family Bible with birth dates and marriages scrawled in elegant, looping script. I scoured the photographs, looking for any face that didn't quite fit, any backdrop that hinted at a life beyond the familiar. Most were what you'd expect. Picnics in parks, smiling faces on suburban porches, holiday gatherings. Then, tucked away in a small velvet-bound album I hadn't looked at in years, I found it. A photograph, sepia-toned and brittle with age, stood out. It was a picture of a young woman, perhaps in her late teens or early 20s, standing by a body of water. Not a lake, not the ocean. The backdrop was unmistakably a river, wide and slow-moving, flanked by dense, ancient-looking cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. The woman's face was familiar, yet subtly different. Her eyes held a certain wildness, a directness I hadn't seen in any other family photo. Her hair was braided intricately, adorned with small dried wildflowers. She wasn't smiling. Instead, her gaze was fixed somewhere beyond the frame, towards the river, with an expression that was both serene and profoundly melancholic. A small handwritten inscription on the back, in my grandmother's elegant hand, read, Aunt Eleanor.
Circa 1940.
Before she left. Aunt Eleanor? My grandmother's name was Eleanor. This was another Eleanor, a great-aunt I had never heard of. And the river, it looked strikingly similar to the stretches of water around Port Willow. The trees, the slow current, even the way the light hit the water had a haunting resemblance. The inscription, before she left, hung in the air, weighted with unspoken stories. Left where? And why? My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't a tenuous link. It was a direct hit. My family had a connection to a river, and to a woman who left. The implications were staggering. Was this the personal connection I'd been sensing? Had my great-aunt Eleanor been one of the river folk? Armed with this new, unsettling piece of information, I felt a fresh surge of urgency. I needed to find out more about this other Eleanor. I decided to visit the Port Willow Historical Society, a small, dusty building crammed with local archives. The woman behind the counter, a kindly but sharp-eyed older woman named Martha, listened patiently as I explained I was researching local family histories, subtly omitting my personal connection for the moment. Eleanor, she mused, tapping a pen against her chin. It's a common enough name, dear. Do you have a last name for her? I hesitated. Just Eleanor, I said, feeling a pang of frustration. I believe she lived here or nearby, sometime in the early to mid-20th century. Martha gave me a knowing look, a flicker of something unreadable in her gaze. Ah, the Eleanors of the river, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. There have been a few, but there was one a long time ago who was different. She was of the river, truly. knew its currents, its moods, its secrets. They say she had a gift. My breath hitched. A gift. Martha leaned closer, her voice barely audible. She could feel the river, they said. Knew where the fish would run, where the storms would gather. And she could see things others couldn't. But she was restless too, always looking beyond the banks. She paused, her eyes fixed on mine with an unnerving intensity. The river folk, they don't take kindly to those who leave, not truly. The river keeps its own. A chill snaked up my spine, colder than any river breeze. What happened to her? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Martha shook her head slowly. She just vanished one day. Left her home, her family. Some say she just walked into the mist and never looked back. Others say the river took her. Angered, she tried to leave its hold. She straightened up, her expression hardening subtly. But that's just old gossip, dear. Not fit for a respectable historical record. She gave me a tight, unconvincing smile. Is there anything else I can help you with? I mumbled my thanks, my mind reeling. Another Eleanor. Vanished. The river keeps its own. It was too much to be a coincidence. My great-aunt Eleanor, the one in the photo, who left. Was she the Eleanor of the river? The one with the gift? The one who vanished? As I left the historical society, the air felt heavier, the silence of the town more profound. I felt an undeniable prickle on the back of my neck, the sensation of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but saw only the usual sleepy storefronts, the empty street. Yet, the feeling persisted, an invisible tether connecting me to unseen eyes. That night, back in my rented cottage, the unease gnawed at me. The river, just beyond the tree line, seemed to hum with a low, resonant frequency. I tried to focus on my notes, to piece together the fragments, but my thoughts kept returning to Martha's words, to the photo of my great-aunt, and to the unsettling feeling that something was closing in. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then plunged the cottage into darkness. My heart leaped into my throat. The power grid in Port Willow wasn't exactly robust, but this felt different. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic chirping of crickets and the soft, lapping sound of the river. I fumbled for my phone, its flashlight beam cutting a stark path through the gloom. As I moved towards the window, a faint scratching sound echoed from the wall closest to the river. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like fingernails dragging lightly across wood. I froze, every nerve ending screaming. It wasn't an animal. It was too precise, too human. Then a whisper, so faint I almost convinced myself it was the wind, seemed to brush against the glass of the window. The river knows who belongs. I spun around, flashlight beam darting wildly through the empty room. Nothing. Just the shadows dancing with my fear. My breath caught in my throat. Had I imagined it? The scratching stopped. The whisper faded. But the terror remained, a cold, hard knot in my stomach. Someone was out there. Someone was watching me. And they knew I was digging into the past of the river folk. Perhaps even knew about my connection to the vanished Eleanor. The power didn't return that night. I spent the rest of the dark hours huddled under a blanket, the phone clutched in my hand, its battery slowly draining. Every creak of the old cottage, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a fresh wave of panic through me. The river's presence, once a comforting lullaby, was now a menacing growl. The next morning, exhausted and on edge, I noticed something new. On the small, weathered wooden porch railing, just outside my front door, a small, intricately woven bundle of dried reeds and river grasses had been placed. It was tied with a piece of dark, rough twine, and nestled within the reeds was a single smooth black river stone, unlike any I had seen before. It felt ancient, heavy with an unspoken significance. This was no random act. This was a message, a warning, and it spoke directly to the old ways of the river folk, a tangible sign of their traditions, their beliefs, and perhaps their displeasure. The black stone, cold and unyielding in my palm, seemed to pulse with a silent energy. It felt like a boundary marker, a statement. I looked out at the river, its surface shimmering deceptively in the morning light. The quiet beauty I had initially perceived was gone, replaced by a brooding, watchful intensity. The story wasn't just personal. It was also a direct challenge to the deeply entrenched traditions of this place. The river folk were not just a community. They were a force connected to the land, to the water, and to secrets I was only just beginning to uncover. And they were letting me know, in no uncertain terms, that I was treading on sacred ground, disturbing an ancient peace. The bundle, the stone, the whisper in the dark. They were all part of a language I was only just starting to understand, a language of warning. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that ignoring it was no longer an option. I had stepped into something far older, far more powerful, and far more dangerous than I could have ever conceived. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the familiar landscape of trees and water twisting into something menacing and alien. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat echoing the terrifying realization that had just slammed into me. This wasn't a case for the police, not for forensic teams, not for rational inquiry. This was something else entirely. The air, once merely humid, now felt thick with an unseen presence, a weight that pressed down, stealing my breath. Every rustle of leaves, every distant splash from the river, conjured phantoms in my mind's eye. Fear, raw and primal, clawed at my throat. My first instinct was to run, to flee this cursed place and never look back. To dismiss it all as the ravings of an overtired mind, the product of too many sleepless nights chasing a ghost. But the images were too vivid, the warnings too clear. The intricate knot, the strange guttural sounds, the feeling of being watched. They weren't random occurrences. They were a language, a deliberate communication, and I was finally starting to understand its terrifying grammar. I had been blind, utterly and completely blind. I had approached Michael's disappearance with the conventional tools of investigation, searching for human perpetrators, logical motives, tangible evidence. But what if the perpetrator wasn't human? What if the motive was something ancient, something beyond our modern understanding of justice or crime? What if the evidence was woven into the very fabric of the land, whispered on the wind, etched into the dark waters of the river itself? The police had dismissed the river folk as superstitious nonsense, a colorful local legend. But what if the legend was a shield? A story told to keep outsiders from prying too deeply into truths better left undisturbed. What if the old ways weren't just quaint traditions, but a set of rules, a pact, a delicate balance maintained for generations, and Michael had, unknowingly or not, shattered it? I needed to find someone who understood. Someone who hadn't dismissed the whispers, who still remembered the stories, the warnings, the forgotten wisdom of this place. The local gossip had been useless, filled with half-truths and speculative malice. The police were a dead end, their logic unprepared for this kind of darkness. I needed an oracle, a keeper of the old lore. My mind raced, sifting through every face, every name, every fleeting conversation I'd had since arriving in town. Most people here were like me, transplants or descendants who had long ago shed the more peculiar beliefs of their ancestors. But there had to be someone. Someone who lived on the fringes, perhaps someone who still felt the pull of the past. Then a name surfaced, an almost forgotten mention from a conversation at the general store about old Mr. Abernathy, who lived in a ramshackle house on the far side of the old logging road. More recluse than man, they'd said, full of strange tales and even stranger silences. He was known for collecting river oddities and things the water brought up. He sounded exactly like the kind of person who might possess the knowledge I now desperately craved. The sun was dipping towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep purples, but I barely noticed its beauty. My focus was singular, driven by an urgency that bordered on desperation. I drove my beat-up SUV down the winding, unpaved logging road, the tires kicking up clouds of dust. The road grew narrower, more overgrown, the trees closing in like watchful sentinels. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The further I drove, the more I felt like I was traveling back in time, leaving the modern world behind. Finally, a clearing. A small, dilapidated cabin, leaning precariously to one side, emerged from the encroaching woods. It was barely visible through the tangle of overgrown bushes and ancient, gnarled trees. A faint wisp of smoke curled from its stone chimney, suggesting life within. The yard was a chaotic menagerie of forgotten tools, rusted metal, and what looked like salvaged river debris, smooth, water-worn stones, twisted pieces of driftwood, and even a small, overturned rowboat half buried in weeds. I parked the SUV a respectful distance away, the gravel crunching loudly in the oppressive quiet. As I stepped out, the silence deepened, broken only by the distant croaking of frogs and the gentle sigh of the wind through the pines. A shiver traced its way down my spine, a premonition of something unsettling. I walked towards the cabin, my boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth. The porch creaked under my weight as I approached the front door, which was made of rough-hewn planks, scarred and weathered by time. There was no doorbell, no knocker. I hesitated for a moment, then rapped my knuckles against the worn wood. Silence. I waited, my breath held. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Just as I was about to knock again, the door creaked open, revealing a sliver of darkness within. A pair of eyes, roomy and ancient, peered out from the gloom. Mr. Abernathy. He was a slight man, his frame bent with age, his skin like parchment stretched over sharp bones. A wispy beard, the color of dirty snow, framed a mouth that seemed perpetually downturned. He wore faded overalls and a patched flannel shirt. His eyes, though, were what truly held me. They were the color of the river at dusk, deep, murky, and full of an unspoken history. They regarded me with a mixture of suspicion and resignation, as if he had been expecting me, or someone like me, for a very long time. "Mr. Abernathy?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. He didn't answer, just continued to stare, his gaze unwavering. It felt like he was looking not at me but through me into the very core of my being. "My name is..." I started, then paused. "I'm investigating the disappearance of Michael Peterson." A flicker, a subtle shift in those ancient eyes. He grunted, a low, gravelly sound that seemed to rumble up from his very depths. "Peterson," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. "Should have stayed away from the water." My heart leaped. He knew. "What do you mean, Mr. Abernathy? What happened to him?" He pushed the door open a little wider, just enough for me to see into the cluttered, dimly lit interior. The cabin was a repository of forgotten things, shelves overflowing with books, jars filled with dried herbs, and countless artifacts that seemed to have been pulled from the riverbed itself. Smooth stones, pieces of old pottery, tangled knots of rope, and strange, almost organic shapes of wood. The air inside was heavy with the scent of damp earth, old paper, and something else, something vaguely metallic and primordial. "The river takes what's owed," he said, his eyes now fixed on a particularly gnarled piece of driftwood on a nearby shelf. "Always has. Always will." "Owed? What's owed?" I pressed, stepping closer, my voice hushed. "Are you talking about the river folk stories? The old ways?" He turned his gaze back to me, and for a moment I felt a profound chill, as if I were standing before a being that had witnessed centuries unfold. "Stories ain't always just stories, son. Sometimes they're warnings. Sometimes they're history. Sometimes they're the truth." He paused, his gaze drifting towards a small, intricately carved wooden figure sitting on a dusty mantelpiece. It depicted a vaguely humanoid shape, elongated and distorted, with features that seemed to blend human and aquatic elements. It was unsettling. "The river around here," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's old, older than any of us. It has its own memory, its own guardians, and its own rules." "What kind of rules?" I asked, my blood running cold. This was it. This was the knowledge I sought. He sighed, a long, weary sound. "For generations, my people, the ones who truly lived by this river, they understood. They knew where to fish, where to build, where to tread lightly, and where not to go. They knew what the river demanded. And what does it demand? Respect, silence, and sometimes..." He trailed off, his eyes narrowing. "Sometimes it asks for a tribute, a gift, an offering to keep the balance, to keep it from taking what it wants." My mind flashed back to Michael's boat, found near that secluded cove. The unusual knot. Michael. Did he break a rule? Did he disturb something? Mr. Abernathy finally looked directly at me, a deep sorrow in his eyes. "The river has its secrets, places where the veil is thin, places where the old ones sleep or watch, places where offerings were made long, long ago." Michael Peterson. He was a curious man, too curious for his own good. He went where he shouldn't have. He found something that wasn't meant to be found, and he took it. My breath hitched. Took what? What did he take? The old man shook his head slowly, his gaze distant, lost in memory. "He disturbed a resting place. He took a piece of the river's memory, and the river, it remembers. It remembers what was given, and it remembers what was stolen." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. A piece of the river's memory. What could that mean? A relic? An ancient artifact? And if Michael took it, what was the consequence? So the river, or these guardians, they took him as retribution? I whispered, almost afraid to voice the thought aloud. Mr. Abernathy just nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. They claim their own. Not to harm, not out of malice, but to restore the balance. To mend the tear. The river doesn't forget. And once it's set its sights, there's no arguing with it. No running from it. A profound dread settled deep in my bones. Michael hadn't just disappeared. He had been claimed. And by digging into this, by asking these questions, by even knowing about the old ways, had I now drawn the river's attention to myself? Had I become a part of its memory too? The air in the small cabin suddenly felt impossibly heavy, the shadows in the corner seeming to deepen and writhe. I felt an undeniable prickle on the back of my neck, the distinct sensation of being watched, not just by the old man, but by something far older, something that had listened to our entire conversation from the depths of the river's secrets. I immediately spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced I would see eyes glinting from the dense foliage along the bank, or perhaps a ripple where no current should be. Nothing. Only the placid, dark surface of the water, reflecting the last sliver of twilight sky. The ancient cypress trees stood like silent sentinels, their gnarled roots disappearing into the murky depths. There was no movement, no sound beyond the gentle lapping of water against the old canoe. Yet the feeling persisted, a cold, insistent pressure, as if unseen hands were pressing against the skin between my shoulder blades. Jacob, however, hadn't moved. His eyes, though still fixed on the river, seemed to hold a new, unsettling glint, a knowing amusement that sent a chill down my spine. He didn't need to ask why I'd turned. He already knew. He knew because he felt it too, or perhaps he had always felt it. "They listen," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the still air with an unnerving clarity. "Always listen. The river has ears, child, and eyes, and a memory longer than any man's." I forced myself to speak, my voice a little shakier than I would have liked. Who are they, Jacob? What are you talking about?" He finally turned his gaze from the river to me, and for the first time, I saw not just the wisdom of age, but a profound, almost primal fear etched deep within his ancient eyes. It was a fear he had learned to live with, a constant companion. "The river folk," he said, the name sounding less like a quaint local term and more like a designation for something ancient and powerful. "Not like us. Not flesh and blood, not anymore. They are the river's memory, its will. The ones who tend to the old ways, even when the rest of the world forgets." My mind, trained in logic and journalistic skepticism, wrestled with his words. This was folklore, superstition, a product of isolation and an aging mind. Yet, the prickle on my neck hadn't faded. The air around us felt dense, charged with an invisible presence that hummed just beneath the surface of reality. "The old ways," I repeated, trying to sound calm. "What exactly are these old ways, Jacob?" He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing, drawing me into a confidence that felt less like sharing knowledge and more like an initiation. "The river demands respect. Gives life, yes, but it can take it back. It sustains us, feeds us, carries our burdens. But it asks for something in return. A balance. Tribute." The word hung in the air, heavy and dark. Tribute. My mind immediately went to dark rituals, ancient sacrifices. I tried to push the thoughts away, to ground myself in what I knew. This was a man talking about his beliefs, his culture. But his tone, the weight of his words, made it feel far more immediate, far more real. "What kind of tribute?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Jacob's gaze drifted back to the river, a troubled shadow passing over his face. "Sometimes it's a song. Sometimes it's a promise. Sometimes it's a life. Not taken by force, mind you. Never by force. But offered. Given freely, in understanding of the river's power. It's how the balance is kept. How the river stays calm, and the fish keep biting, and the storms don't swallow us whole." My breath hitched. "Are you saying people offer themselves to the river?" The idea was horrifying, yet he spoke of it with such a detached, almost reverent tone, as if it were a natural part of life here. He nodded slowly. "Not often. Only when the river calls. And when it calls, you hear it. Deep in your bones. Pull you can't fight. It's an honor, they say, to become part of the river's memory, to feed its secrets." A shiver, colder than the night air, snaked down my spine. This wasn't just folklore. This was a living, breathing belief system, one that apparently involved human sacrifice, even if couched in terms of honor and tribute. And the way he said feed its secrets, it made the river sound like a hungry entity, not just a body of water. As if on cue, a sudden violent ripple erupted from the center of the river, spreading outwards towards our canoe. It wasn't the gentle disturbance of a fish or a falling branch. This was a powerful, almost deliberate surge, as if something massive had just shifted beneath the surface. The canoe rocked violently, almost throwing me off balance. I gripped the sides, my knuckles white. What was that? I gasped, my eyes wide, scanning the disturbed water. Jacob remained perfectly still, his gaze piercing the now churning depths. "It heard you," he whispered, his voice laced with a strange blend of fear and reverence. "It doesn't like questions about its hunger." The water around us began to swirl unnaturally. A thick, cold mist, smelling faintly of damp earth and something metallic, began to rise from the surface, clinging to the air, obscuring the distant banks. The cypress trees, moments ago merely dark shapes, now seemed to writhe in the fog, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. The air grew heavy, pressing down on us, making it difficult to breathe. I could feel my rational mind screaming for an explanation. A strong current, a gas pocket, a large animal. But my instincts, the primal part of my brain that had been dormant for too long, knew better. This was something else. This was the river itself responding. "Jacob, we need to go," I urged, my voice tight with panic. "This isn't safe." He didn't respond, his eyes still fixed on the swirling mist. Then, through the thickening fog, I saw it. A faint, shimmering light, deep within the water, near where the initial disturbance had occurred. It pulsed, a soft, ethereal glow like bioluminescence, but far too large, far too deliberate. It was moving slowly, purposefully, just beneath the surface, drawing closer to our canoe. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It looked like a distant lantern, but it was under the water, and it was coming for us. "That's one of them," Jacob said, his voice barely audible above the new, low hum that seemed to emanate from the river itself. The hum was deep, resonant, a vibration that I felt in my bones, a sound that seemed to be speaking directly to something ancient within me. The river's eyes. They watch. They judge. The light intensified, growing brighter, larger as it approached. I could now discern a vague, elongated shape around it, a formless mass that seemed to shift and undulate with the current. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't an animal I recognized. It was something elemental, a part of the river yet distinct. A terrifying thought crystallized in my mind. The feeling of being watched wasn't just a general presence. It was this. This shimmering, submerged entity was the one listening, the one judging. And it was now directly beneath our canoe. The air grew even colder, the mist so thick I could barely see Jacob, who was only a few feet away. I felt an overwhelming urge to jump, to swim, to flee, but a paralyzing terror held me captive. My muscles locked, my breath caught in my throat. Then the hum intensified, becoming a low guttural growl that vibrated through the hull of the canoe, through my very bones. The water beneath us began to churn violently, not just rippling but boiling, as if an immense, unseen force was struggling to break free. The canoe lurched, tossed like a toy. I screamed, a raw, involuntary sound ripped from my throat. Jacob finally seemed to snap out of his trance. His eyes, now wide with genuine terror, met mine. "It's angry," he choked out, his voice hoarse. "You angered it. Your questions, your doubt. It doesn't like that." He frantically grabbed the paddle, plunging it into the turbulent water, attempting to steer us away from the epicenter of the disturbance. But it was useless. The canoe was caught in an invisible vortex, spinning wildly, closer and closer to the shimmering light that now pulsed with an aggressive, malevolent intensity directly beneath us. I could feel the cold seeping into my skin, not just from the mist, but from the water itself, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to drain the warmth from my very core. The metallic scent grew stronger, mixed with something else now, something ancient and decaying, like stagnant blood and forgotten earth. A sudden immense pressure hit the bottom of the canoe, a jarring impact that sent a tremor through the entire vessel. It felt as if something vast and heavy had just bumped us from below, testing our resistance. The canoe groaned, would protesting against an unseen force. "Hold on," Jacob yelled, his voice strained, fear clearly dominating his composure now. He was paddling with all his might, but the current, or whatever force was at play, was overwhelming. We were being pulled inexorably towards the source of the glow. Through the swirling mist, I thought I saw shapes in the water, dark, shadowy forms moving just beyond the reach of the light. They were indistinct, fleeting like peripheral visions, but they were there. Many of them. And they were circling us. The hum beneath the canoe intensified into a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality. The shimmering light below us flared, illuminating the water around it with an unholy glow, revealing not just the elongated shape, but something else, something I desperately wished I hadn't seen. For a fleeting second, through the churn of the water and the thick mist, I saw it. A large, pale, almost translucent hand, with long, slender fingers, reaching up from the depths, brushing against the underside of our canoe. It wasn't human. It was far too large, too alien, and its skin seemed to shimmer with the same ethereal light as the entity itself. It was reaching, searching. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a feeling of being watched. This was a direct, physical manifestation. The river wasn't just listening. It was touching, and it felt like it was trying to pull us down. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a feeling of being watched. This was a direct, physical manifestation. The river wasn't just listening. It was touching, and it felt like it was trying to pull us down. A gasp tore from Jessica's throat, a sound raw with terror. Michael, who had been laughing moments before, was now frozen, his eyes wide with an impossible fear. The water around the canoe, which had been calm only seconds ago, began to churn with a subtle, unnatural turbulence. It wasn't a strong current or a ripple from the wind. It was a localized, deliberate disturbance, centered directly beneath our small craft. The canoe itself felt heavy, sluggish, as if invisible hands were gripping its keel, dragging us downwards. "Paddle!" I yelled, my voice cracking, a desperate command that was more a plea to myself than to my friends. "Paddle now!" We plunged our paddles into the water with a frantic energy, but it was like trying to push through thick mud. The river resisted, groaning a low guttural sound that seemed to emanate not from the water's surface, but from its very depths. The air grew heavy, damp and cold, pressing down on us, stealing our breath. Jessica whimpered, her paddle strokes weak and erratic, her eyes darting across the dark surface as if expecting something to erupt from it at any moment. Michael, usually the most pragmatic of us, was visibly shaking, his face pale and slick with sweat. We fought with every ounce of strength we had, aiming for the nearest bank, a stretch of gnarled cypress roots and dense undergrowth. But the river was an adversary now, not a path. It pulled at the canoe, spinning us slowly, deliberately, away from our intended course. The sensation of being watched intensified, evolving into a feeling of being held, like prey caught in a web. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the water, and everything to do with the ancient, malevolent presence that surrounded us. "It's not letting us go," Jessica cried, tears streaming down her face. Her voice was thin, barely audible above the strange, whispering current. Just then a faint, almost imperceptible shift occurred. The dragging sensation lessened, the churning subsided ever so slightly. It wasn't a release but a pause, like a predator momentarily loosening its grip before a new attack. I seized the opportunity. "Now! Push for that bank!" With renewed desperation we dug our paddles in, our muscles screaming in protest. The canoe lurched forward slowly at first, then gaining a fraction of momentum. We scraped against the muddy bank, the sound of wood on earth a symphony of relief. We scrambled out, abandoning the canoe, our legs unsteady beneath us. The ground felt solid, real, a stark contrast to the deceptive fluidity of the river. We didn't stop to catch our breath. We stumbled through the thicket, thorns tearing at our clothes, branches whipping our faces, driven by a primal need to put as much distance as possible between us and that menacing water. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out, finally collapsing in a small clearing deeper in the woods. The air here was still and silent, a welcome reprieve from the river's oppressive presence. But the terror lingered, a cold knot in my stomach. What was that?" Michael gasped, hunched over trying to regain his breath. His voice was hoarse, tinged with disbelief. "That wasn't a current. That was alive." Jessica simply sobbed, burying her face in her hands. She was usually the toughest of us, the one who laughed at ghost stories. Seeing her so utterly broken twisted my gut. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. But it felt like it was trying to take us, pull us under. The memory of that cold, unseen touch sent shivers down my spine. It felt ancient, hungry. We sat there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the pounding of our hearts and the distant, mocking murmur of the river. The sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, but the beauty was lost on us. All we saw was the encroaching twilight, bringing with it a fresh wave of anxiety. We couldn't stay out here in the woods exposed. We needed shelter, a place to think, to process this impossible horror. Then through the fading light I spotted something. A faint, almost imperceptible trail, barely more than a deer path, leading deeper into the woods away from the river. It looked old, overgrown, but it was a path nonetheless. "There," I pointed, my voice still shaky. "Maybe there's an old cabin, a hunting lodge. Anything. We can't stay here." With a shared unspoken agreement, we pushed ourselves up, our bodies aching, our minds reeling. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of fear through us. The woods, once a place of adventure, now felt alien and hostile. We followed the faint path, our flashlights now our only beacons against the deepening gloom. After what felt like miles, the trees thinned slightly, and a dilapidated structure emerged from the shadows. It was an old fishing shack, barely more than a shed, leaning precariously to one side. Its windows boarded up and its paint long peeled away. Rusting tools lay scattered around the porch, and a defunct lantern hung crookedly by the door. It was far from inviting, but it was shelter. And crucially, it was away from the river. We forced open the creaking door, a cloud of dust and the smell of damp earth greeting us. Inside it was dark and cramped but dry. An old, overturned wooden crate served as a makeshift table, and a couple of rickety chairs lay scattered. There was a crude stone fireplace, long unused, and shelves lined with empty, cobweb-laden jars. "At least we're out of the elements," Michael said, trying to sound optimistic, but his voice lacked conviction. He used his phone's flashlight to sweep the room, revealing the accumulated grime of decades. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed something else. Carvings. Crude, almost primitive symbols etched into the wooden walls, particularly around the fireplace. They were spiraling patterns, distorted fish, and strange, humanoid figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. They looked ancient, weathered, almost part of the wood itself. "What are these?" Jessica whispered, her fear momentarily overshadowed by a flicker of curiosity. She traced one of the symbols with her finger. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. They were unsettling, these carvings, reminiscent of something tribal, something forgotten. They spoke of a time before, of beliefs that predated modern understanding. Then Michael's flashlight beam landed on something tucked away on one of the dusty shelves. It was a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. He reached for it, pulling it down carefully. Dust motes danced in the flashlight's beam. "Looks like someone left their diary," he muttered, trying to lighten the mood, but his voice wavered. He opened it to a random page. The handwriting was cramped, faded, but legible. He began to read aloud, slowly, piecing together the words. June 14th, 1937. "The river is restless tonight. Old Man Hemlock says it's hungry. They haven't brought their offerings in weeks. Foolish city folk think they know better. But the river remembers. The river always remembers. It takes what it's owed. Saw something in the water today downstream from the bend. Not a fish. Not an animal. Something reaching." Michael stopped, his voice trailing off, the words hanging heavy in the musty air. We exchanged terrified glances. "Offerings," Jessica breathed. "The river is hungry?" My mind raced back to the old man in town, his cryptic warnings about the old ways and how the river doesn't forget. It all clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. This wasn't just a local superstition. This wasn't some campfire ghost story. This was real. The carvings, the journal, the old man's words, and what we had just experienced on the water. It was all connected. "The river folk," I whispered, the name from the town's folklore suddenly taking on a terrifying new meaning. The ones who appeased the river. The ones who kept it from taking. A profound sense of dread settled over us. We weren't just lost hikers who'd stumbled upon a strange local legend. We had disturbed something ancient, something placated by generations of forgotten rituals. And now this entity, this river folk or whatever it truly was awake. And it was hungry. A soft scratching sound came from the exterior wall of the shack, just behind where Michael was standing. It was faint at first, like twigs brushing against the wood, but then it grew louder, more rhythmic. Asterisk scrape, scrape, Scrape. Asterisk, it wasn't the wind. It sounded like something dragging its way up the side of the building. We froze, our eyes wide, fixed on the wall. The scratching moved, slowly ascending, until it seemed to be right above us on the roof. Then a distinct thump, as if something heavy had landed. And then silence. A silence far more terrifying than any sound. We huddled together, barely breathing. The small shack, our temporary refuge, suddenly felt like a flimsy cage. Whatever was out there, whatever had been in the river, it hadn't let us go. It had followed us. It was here. And it was waiting. The silence that followed the initial thud was even worse than the noise itself. It was a predatory silence, like a hunter holding its breath. We strained our ears, trying to discern any movement, any whisper of the unseen menace. Michael, ever the pragmatist, was already trying to reinforce the flimsy door with a rusty old shovel he'd found propped in a corner. His hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the sheer raw terror that vibrated through all of us. Jessica, huddled close to me, whispered, "What was that? What is that?" Her voice was a thin thread, barely audible above the pounding of my own heart. David, usually the most outwardly composed, had gone pale. His eyes darted to the single grimy window, then to the gaps in the shack's wooden planks. It's circling us," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "I can feel it." And he was right. A faint scraping sound began, not continuous but intermittent, like something dragging itself slowly around the perimeter of the shack. It was low to the ground, heavy and deliberate. Each scrape sent a fresh jolt of fear through us. It wasn't an animal. No animal moved like that. This was something else. Something intelligent, something patient. Then came the smell. A damp, earthy odor, mingled with something metallic and vaguely sweet, like stagnant water and old blood. It seeped through the cracks, filling our lungs, making us gag. It was the smell of the river, but amplified, corrupted, made horrifying. Michael finished bracing the door, then turned, his face grim. "We need a plan. We can't just sit here." "A plan for what?" Emily choked out, her face buried in her hands. "How do you fight something you can't even see? Something that came out of the river." Suddenly, a low guttural moan vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was a sound of ancient, raw hunger. A sound that resonated deep in our primal fear centers. It felt like it was coming from underneath us. Panic began to set in. Chris, who had been eerily quiet, suddenly sprang up, his eyes wide and wild. "There has to be another way out. A back door, a hatch, anything." He scrambled around the small space, his hands pawing frantically at the walls. "Chris, stop," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "You'll just draw more attention." But it was too late. As he pulled away, his hand brushed against a loose plank near the back wall. It shifted, revealing not a way out, but a small dark recess. It was too deep for a simple crack. It was a hidden compartment. Michael quickly moved over, prying the plank open further. Inside, tucked away, was a small leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age, and a collection of crude, carved wooden effigies. They were unsettling to look at, distorted figures with elongated limbs and gaping mouths, some clutching small stylized fish. "What is this?" Jessica whispered, her voice trembling as Michael carefully pulled out the journal. As he opened it, a faint, musty smell of parchment and dried herbs wafted out. The handwriting was cramped and spidery, almost illegible in the dim light filtering through the grime. But one word, scrawled repeatedly on the first page, stood out starkly: dredge. "Dredge," David repeated, leaning in. "What does that mean?" Michael flipped through the pages. Most were filled with strange symbols and what looked like fragmented prayers or warnings. But then he stopped on a page, his breath catching. It was a drawing, a crude but unmistakable depiction of the river, and emerging from its depths, a monstrous, elongated form, vaguely humanoid but with webbed limbs and eyes that seemed to glow in the drawing. And surrounding it, smaller figures, the river folk, offering something to it. Below the drawing, in English, albeit archaic, was a chilling passage. "The river claims its own. The deep one stirs. When the waters rise, so does its hunger. Offerings must be made. The old ways protect us, lest the dredge take all." My blood ran cold. "The dredge," I breathed. "That's what it is. That's what's out there." "Offerings," Emily whispered, her eyes fixed on the drawing. "What kind of offerings?" A new sound erupted from outside. A sickening thump against the wall, followed by a splintering groan of wood. The shack shook violently. Whatever was out there was no longer circling. It was actively trying to get in. "It knows we're here," Chris said, his voice barely a gasp. "It smelled us. It wants to get in." Michael quickly scanned the journal again, frantically searching for anything that might help, any weakness, any countermeasure. There's mentions of wards," he mumbled, pointing to some symbols. "And light. It says light repels the deep one." "Light," Jessica repeated, looking around the dark shack. We had a single flickering lantern, barely enough to illuminate our faces. Just then, a section of the wall near the door burst inwards, splintering wood flying across the room. A gaping hole appeared, and through it we saw it. Not all of it, just a glimpse. A dark, slick, glistening mass like wet stone, with something that could have been an eye, a single unblinking orb reflecting the dim lantern light with a malevolent green glow. It was bigger than we could have imagined, filling the opening, its surface shimmering with river water and something else, something foul. A collective scream tore from our throats. The smell intensified, overpowering, suffocating. "The light!" Michael yelled, grabbing the lantern. "Throw it! Shine it!" But before he could, the creature began to squeeze itself through the opening, its immense form groaning against the wood. It was slow, agonizingly slow but relentless. Its webbed, clawed hand, impossibly long and thick, reached into the shack, its fingers splaying wide, searching. David, with a desperate surge of adrenaline, grabbed one of the crude wooden effigies from the hidden compartment. It was a small fish-like carving with a sharp, pointed nose. He didn't know why, but a wild instinct took over. He lunged forward, not at the creature, but at the lantern Michael was still holding, his hand brushing the hot metal. "No, David, what are you doing?" I cried out, but he ignored me. Instead, with a guttural roar, he hurled the small, pointed effigy not at the creature, but at the ceiling of the shack. It wasn't a weapon. It was an act of pure, unadulterated desperation. The carving struck a loose beam and shattered, sending splinters of dry wood scattering. But as it shattered, something else happened. A strange, faint, almost imperceptible hum seemed to emanate from the broken wood, a high-pitched resonance that vibrated through the shack. And for a split second, the monstrous hand hesitated. The green eye seemed to flicker, as if momentarily disoriented. "It's the carvings," Emily gasped, her eyes wide. "They're not just offerings. They're wards. Or warnings." She pointed to the symbols in the journal. "See? This symbol on the effigy. It's the same one for repel." Michael, connecting the dots, immediately understood. The river folk. They used these, not just for the creature but to keep others away, to protect their secrets. The creature, as if recovering, let out another chilling moan and began to force its way in again, its movements more frantic, more powerful. The entire shack groaned under the pressure. We couldn't hold out much longer. "We need more," David yelled, scrambling back to the compartment. He pulled out another effigy, a larger one, and thrust it into Michael's hand. "Break it! Break them all!" Michael, with renewed hope, slammed the larger carving against the wall. This time the hum was louder, more distinct. The creature recoiled slightly, pulling its immense hand back a few inches. It didn't retreat entirely, but it gave us a precious few seconds. "It hates the sound," Jessica realized, her voice filled with a desperate surge of understanding. "It's not the light, it's the frequency, the way these carvings break." But we only had a few more. And each time, the creature only recoiled for a moment before pressing its attack again, stronger and more furious. It was learning. It was adapting. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice firm despite the tremor in my hands. "We have to go. Now, while we still have a chance." "Go where?" Chris demanded, looking around wildly. "It's everywhere." "The journal," Michael panted, flipping through the pages one last time. "It mentions a sacred grove, a place where the old ways are strongest, place of true light." He pointed to a crude map drawn on one of the final pages, showing a path leading deeper into the woods, away from the river, towards a cluster of ancient trees marked with the same warding symbols as the effigies. "It's a trap," Emily cried. "Why would the river folk lead us to where their old ways are strongest if they want us gone?" "Because," David said, his eyes fixed on the map, "if the dredge is their god or their curse, then maybe the true light isn't for us. Maybe it's for it. Maybe it's where they contain it." or where they appease it. The creature outside let out a furious bellow, and the remaining section of the wall shattered completely, revealing more of its colossal, repulsive form. We could see its torso now, a vast dark mass of muscle and slick skin, its multiple eyes glowing with a malevolent ancient intelligence. It was trying to force its entire body through the opening. "We have no choice," Michael declared, his face set. "It's either stay here and be taken or risk the grove. At least there we might find answers. Or something to fight back with." He grabbed the journal, tucking it into his jacket. "Follow me," he ordered, not waiting for a response. He didn't head for the broken wall, but instead kicked open the rickety back door of the shack, which miraculously held on its rusty hinges. The night air hit us, cold and damp, carrying the stench of the river and the creature. We burst out into the moonless darkness, the sounds of the dredge tearing apart the shack behind us. It was a desperate, blind dash into the unknown, guided only by a fragment of a map and the terrifying hope that the sacred grove held not just answers but salvation. We ran, stumbling over roots and unseen obstacles, the sounds of the creature's destruction echoing behind us. Every rustle of leaves, every snapped twig, sent shivers down our spines. We were running deeper into the heart of the river folks' territory, moving towards a place they considered sacred, a place where their old ways were strongest. And as we ran, a new unsettling thought began to form in my mind. What if the true light wasn't meant to repel the dredge at all? What if it was meant to reveal it? Or worse, to feed it? The trees grew thicker, older, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers against the sliver of moonlight that occasionally pierced the canopy. The air grew heavy, pregnant with a sense of ancient power, and a faint rhythmic thrumming began to pulse through the ground beneath our feet. We were getting closer, closer to the sacred grove, closer to the heart of the mystery, and perhaps closer to our end. The ground beneath my feet felt strangely soft, almost spongy. The trees here were unlike any I had ever seen, their bark gnarled and twisted into grotesque shapes, some bearing faint, almost faded carvings, the same unsettling symbols we'd seen in the journal and on the broken effigies. A low mist, thick and chilling, began to rise from the undergrowth, clinging to our legs, obscuring our vision. Then, through a break in the ancient foliage, we saw it. A clearing. And in its center, not a shrine, not an altar, but a massive ancient tree, its trunk wider than a small car, its branches reaching impossibly high into the sky. And beneath it, arranged in a chillingly precise circle, were dozens upon dozens of the carved wooden effigies, much larger than the ones we found in the shack. Each one faced inward towards the colossal tree, their empty, carved eyes seeming to watch us. And from the very heart of the clearing, from the base of that monstrous tree, pulsed an unearthly emerald green light. It wasn't bright, not like a lamp, but a soft, pervasive glow that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself, illuminating the swirling mist with an eerie, sickly hue. This was the true light. This was the sacred grove, and it was far more terrifying than anything we could have imagined. The sickly glow pulsed, a slow, deliberate breath of light that seemed to draw the very air into its morbid embrace. It wasn't the welcoming warmth of a campfire, nor the cold, sterile beam of a flashlight. This was a living light, an organic luminescence that felt wrong, a cancerous growth in the heart of the ancient forest. It hung heavy in the mist, swirling and coalescing into phantom shapes that writhed at the periphery of our vision. The silence here was absolute, broken only by the frantic thump of our own hearts, a drumbeat against the overwhelming dread. Jessica clutched Michael's arm, her knuckles white. David, usually the stoic one, had his hand on the hilt of his hunting knife, his eyes wide and darting, reflecting the eerie green-yellow light. We had stumbled into a place that defied comprehension, a pocket of the world where the veil between the known and the utterly alien was terrifyingly thin. "What is this place?" Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible above the ringing in my ears. "The grove," Michael breathed, his voice rough. "The sacred grove." We took our first tentative steps forward, the damp earth squelching beneath our boots. The mist here was thicker, imbued with the unsettling glow, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe. Every gnarled tree trunk looked like a monstrous sentinel watching, waiting. The air itself felt heavy, thick with an almost metallic scent, mingled with something earthy and sweet, like decaying blossoms and ancient blood. As we moved deeper, the ground began to change. The undergrowth thinned, replaced by a carpet of strange, phosphorescent moss that seemed to feed on the pervasive light, glowing with a soft internal fire. Twisted ancient trees, their branches draped with long silvery lichen, formed a loose circle, their forms barely discernible through the swirling mist. There were no paths, no clearings, just an unbroken expanse of glowing moss and spectral trees, all bathed in that malevolent light. Then we saw them. Rough-hewn stones standing upright, forming a crude, irregular ring within the larger circle of trees. They were squat, unadorned monoliths, covered in the same glowing moss, but their surfaces were marred by strange, shallow carvings. Not symbols we recognized from any culture, but intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to mimic the flow of water, intertwined with abstract shapes that could have been fish, or perhaps something far more sinister, something with too many limbs and too many eyes. "Look," David murmured, pointing a trembling finger. In the center of the stone circle, where the glow was most intense, stood a single massive boulder. It was flat on top like a table, but its sides were rough and irregular, and on its surface the light seemed to pulse with an almost rhythmic intensity, drawing the eye, pulling at something deep within us. It was undeniably an altar, and on the altar there were offerings. Not flowers or fruits, but strange, desiccated bundles of river reeds, tied with sinews that looked suspiciously like animal gut. And scattered among them, small, smooth river stones, each stained with a dark, reddish-brown hue that could only be dried blood. The air around the altar was warmer, almost humid, carrying a faint, cloying sweetness that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. Michael, his face pale and drawn in the eerie light, slowly reached out a hand, not to touch, but to feel the air above the altar. "It's humming," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Can you feel it?" A vibration. We all felt it then, a subtle tremor in the air, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in our very bones. It wasn't a sound we heard with our ears, but a sensation, a deep, pervasive energy that emanated directly from the altar, from the very core of the grove. This was the source of the true light. It wasn't merely illumination. It was a force, an ancient power that had been awakened, or perhaps simply was. As we stood there, mesmerized by the ghastly spectacle, a new detail emerged from the swirling mist. Beyond the altar, almost hidden by the glow, was a small, crudely constructed lean-to. It was made of branches and mud, barely visible, but it was there. And piled haphazardly in front of it were items that sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. A child's worn teddy bear, a faded baseball cap, a woman's delicate silver locket, tarnished and caked with mud, and a man's wallet, its leather cracked and peeling, but still recognizable. These weren't offerings. These were possessions. The possessions of the missing. "Oh my God!" Jessica gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "They brought them here. They brought everything here." The implications were horrifying. This wasn't just a place of ritual. It was a place of collection, a gruesome trophy room for the river folk. The thought that the people themselves might have been brought here, to this very altar, before their possessions were discarded, made my stomach churn. Michael, his eyes fixed on the locket, took a step towards the lean-to. "We need to see if there's anything else. Anything that tells us what they do here." "No," David hissed, grabbing his arm. "Michael, this is too dangerous. They could be back any minute. This place, it feels alive. It feels like it's watching us." He was right. The oppressive silence, the pervasive glow, the unseen hum in the air. It all contributed to an overwhelming sense of being observed, of being trespassers in a domain far older and more powerful than ourselves. Every rustle of a leaf, every creak of a branch sounded like footsteps. But Michael was already pulling away, his gaze grimly determined. "We came this far. We can't turn back now. Not when we're this close to understanding." He crept towards the lean-to, his movements slow and deliberate, each step agonizingly loud in the profound silence. Jessica and I exchanged a terrified glance, then followed, keeping close to David, who moved with his knife drawn, his eyes constantly scanning the swirling mist. As Michael reached the lean-to, he knelt, his fingers carefully sifting through the pile of discarded items. He picked up the wallet, carefully opening its tattered folds. Inside, a driver's license. It's David Miller," he whispered, his voice heavy with dread. "He was one of the first. From 2 years ago." My blood ran cold. 2 years. They had been doing this for at least 2 years. How many had disappeared? How many had been brought to this place? Suddenly, a sound, faint but distinct, cut through the oppressive stillness. It wasn't the wind, nor the creak of a branch. It was a low, rhythmic thrum, deeper than the hum of the altar, and it seemed to be coming from within the mist, somewhere beyond the circle of stones. Jessica froze, her eyes wide with terror. David gripped his knife tighter, his knuckles bone-white. Michael dropped the wallet, his head snapping up, his face etched with a dawning horror. The thrum grew louder, accompanied by another sound now. A low, guttural chanting, barely audible at first, but slowly, inexorably, growing in volume. It was a language we didn't recognize, ancient and primal, filled with harsh consonants and drawn-out vowels, a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of sanity. "They're coming back," David whispered, his voice trembling. "They're coming back to the grove." The chanting swelled closer now, echoing through the mist-shrouded trees. And with it, a new element entered the air, the unmistakable scent of wood smoke, mingled with something else, something cloying and sweet, like burning incense or perhaps burning flesh. We had stumbled into their sacred space, at the very moment of their return. We were trapped, deep within the heart of the river folk's darkest secret, surrounded by the pervasive, sickly glow of the true light, and the horrifying rhythmic chant of their ancient, unspeakable rituals. There was no escape. Not now. We were caught. And the terror of that realization was a cold, sharp blade to the throat. The cold, sharp blade of that realization was indeed at my throat. And then suddenly, it was a real hand, rough and calloused, clamped over my mouth, stifling the scream that had just begun to tear itself from my lungs. Another pair of hands, surprisingly strong, grabbed my arms, twisting them behind my back with brutal efficiency. Jessica, beside me, let out a muffled gasp, a sound quickly swallowed by the rising tide of the cultists chanting. They emerged from the shadows like specters, figures that had been barely visible outlines moments before, now solid and terrifyingly real in the sickly glow. Their faces were gaunt, etched with lines that spoke of hardship and a chilling zeal. Their eyes, wide and unervingly bright, reflected the strange light, like the eyes of deep-sea fish brought to the surface. They wore simple homespun garments, dark and drab, but adorned with crude, strange symbols embroidered with what looked like dried river reeds and matted animal hair. And the smell, a pervasive earthy odor, mixed with something metallic and sweet, like stagnant water and old blood. I struggled, a surge of adrenaline igniting a desperate, futile fight, but they were too many, too strong. My arms were bound tightly with thick, rough cord, pulling my shoulders into an agonizing clinch. Jessica was similarly subdued, her wide, terrified eyes meeting mine across the flickering, unnatural light. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and tears, a silent plea for help that I couldn't answer. We were dragged, not gently, but with a purpose, deeper into the heart of their gathering. The chanting grew louder, a guttural, rhythmic drone that seemed to vibrate in my very bones, a sound that was both ancient and utterly alien. It was a language I didn't recognize, yet it felt strangely familiar, like the whispers of forgotten nightmares. As we were pulled forward, I saw the source of the true light. It wasn't a lamp or a fire, but a large, pulsating orb, suspended somehow above a makeshift altar crafted from ancient, moss-covered stones. The orb itself seemed to be made of solidified light, a luminous, sickly green at its core, radiating outwards into a pallid yellow, and then fading into a ghostly white at its edges. It pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm, each beat sending a shiver through the very air, and through me. Around the altar more cultists swayed, their movements synchronized with the chant, their bodies twisting in unsettling, almost serpentine ways. Their faces were upturned towards the orb, their mouths agape, uttering the strange syllables. In the center of their circle, directly beneath the pulsating light, was a shallow basin carved into the stone altar. It was filled with a murky, dark liquid that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, like a pool of pure shadow. And floating within it, barely visible, were small, dark objects that I couldn't quite discern, but my mind, racing with terror, conjured images of bone and sinew. We were brought to the edge of the circle, forced onto our knees, our backs to the altar, facing the swaying cultists. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. I tried to speak, to yell, but the hand over my mouth remained, firm and unyielding. One of the cultists, a woman whose face was a roadmap of deep wrinkles and whose eyes held an unwavering, chilling intensity, knelt before us. She removed the hand from my mouth, but immediately pressed a rough, damp cloth against my lips. A bitter, earthy taste filled my mouth, and a sudden wave of dizziness washed over me. I fought against it, but my limbs felt heavy, my thoughts sluggish. Jessica, beside me, slumped slightly, her eyes fluttering. The woman spoke, her voice a raspy whisper that cut through the drone of the chant, yet seemed intended only for us. The river takes what is owed. The river demands its due. Her eyes, so ancient and knowing, seemed to pierce right through me. You came to disrupt the balance, to steal what is not yours. The river knows. The river sees. The bitter taste in my mouth intensified, and my head swam. I struggled to focus, to understand her words through the haze that was rapidly descending. What do you want? I managed to croak, my voice weak and slurred. She smiled then, a slow, unsettling stretch of her lips that revealed teeth stained dark, like old river stones. Want? We want nothing but what has always been. The old ways. The true ways. The river provides, and the river must be fed. For too long you outsiders have forgotten. You have taken and given nothing. You have polluted its waters, disturbed its sleep. But the river awakens. And it remembers. Her words were chilling, painting a terrifying picture of a vengeful, sentient entity that demanded tribute. The old ways wasn't just a quaint phrase, it was a horrifying ideology. The true light above pulsed more intensely now, and the liquid in the basin seemed to ripple and churn, though no one touched it. The chant deepened, becoming more insistent, more primal. I looked at Jessica, her head lolling, her breath coming in shallow gasps. They hadn't harmed her physically, not yet, but whatever was on that cloth was powerful. I felt my own body growing heavier, my vision blurring at the edges. The sounds of the chant began to distort, twisting into something less human, more like the groaning of ancient wood, or the deep, resonant hum of the earth itself. The woman stood, her gaze lingering on us for a moment longer, a look of grim satisfaction in her eyes. Then she turned, raising her arms towards the pulsing orb. The cultist chant reached a fever pitch, a deafening crescendo that threatened to shatter my eardrums. The sickly green light intensified, casting grotesque shadows that danced around the clearing, making the trees seem to writhe and contort. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen energy, and a strange metallic tang filled my nostrils, sharper than before. I felt a cold dread seep into my very soul. This wasn't just a ritual, it was a preparation. And we weren't just witnesses. We were the offering. The river folk, with their ancient, unspeakable rituals, were not merely performing a ceremony for the river. They were performing it with us. The basin of murky liquid, the pulsing light, the fervent, terrifying devotion. It all coalesced into a single horrifying truth. We were caught in the currents of their madness, about to be submerged in the very old ways that had claimed so many before us. My last conscious thought, before the world dissolved into a swirling vortex of green light and guttural chanting, was of the river itself, rising, hungry, and waiting. And in that moment I understood what fed truly meant. The world didn't so much dissolve as it was reformed. The green light wasn't a flash, but a viscous, all-encompassing substance that seemed to soak into my very bones, pulling at something deep inside me. The guttural chanting, no longer just sound, vibrated through my chest, a physical force that squeezed the air from my lungs. I felt like a sponge being wrung out, every drop of my essence being drawn towards an unseen, insatiable maw. Then a sudden violent lurch, a sickening drop that stole my breath, and a cold, wet darkness enveloped me. I woke to the insistent drip of water somewhere nearby, a dull ache throbbing behind my eyes, and the chilling realization that I was no longer standing. My body felt heavy, as if filled with lead, and a profound weakness had settled into my limbs. I tried to move, but my muscles protested, screaming in protest. A thick, metallic taste coated my tongue, and the air was heavy with the smell of damp earth, stagnant water, and something else, something indescribably ancient and fetid. My eyes, accustomed to the oppressive gloom, slowly began to discern the contours of my surroundings. I was in a small, roughly carved chamber, the walls slick with condensation. It wasn't a cave, not naturally formed. This was man-made, or at least man-modified, a subterranean prison. My hands were bound behind my back with rough, fibrous rope that chafed my wrists, and my ankles were similarly secured. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of my consciousness. The drip of water became a focal point, a maddening rhythm in the silence. It wasn't just dripping from the ceiling. It was seeping up from the floor in places, forming shallow puddles that reflected the unseen light. I strained my ears, desperate for any sound other than the water. Faintly, so faintly I questioned if it was real. I heard it. A distant rhythmic murmur, almost like a low hum, interspersed with the occasional muffled thud. It was the chanting, still going. My mind, though sluggish, struggled to piece together the fragments of memory. The ritual, the river folk, the green light, and that final horrifying understanding. Fed. They didn't just sacrifice people to the river. They fed people to something in the river. Or perhaps something was the river. The weakness in my body, the profound sense of depletion. It wasn't just from being knocked out. It was as if something had been taken from me. An intangible essence, a vital spark. I pushed against the ropes, gritting my teeth against the pain. The fibers bit into my skin, but I managed to shift, testing the knots. They were tight, expertly tied. This wasn't their first time. How many others had been here, in this very spot? How many before me had felt this same terror, this same draining despair? A sudden sharp sound from above shattered the silence. A clang like metal on stone, followed by hushed voices. They were close. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, pressing myself against the cold, damp wall. The voices were too muffled to make out words, but the tone was low, serious, almost reverent. I could hear the distinct, heavy tread of boots, moving back and forth. Then a sliver of light appeared. Not from the ceiling, but from a narrow crack in the wall, high above my head, where two rough-hewn stones didn't quite meet. It was a faint greenish glow pulsating softly, almost like bioluminescence. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew that light. It was the same sickly green that had engulfed me. I strained my neck, trying to get a better view through the crack, but it was too small, too high. All I could see was the diffuse glow and the occasional shadow passing by. But then one of the shadows paused. It was large, indistinct, but it seemed to coalesce into a form, a shape that was undeniably human, yet subtly wrong. It was one of them, a river folk. And then I heard a new sound, one that sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. A low, guttural gurgle, like water being forced through a narrow pipe, but with a horrifyingly organic quality to it. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something else. And it came from beyond the crack, from whatever lay on the other side of that wall. The green light intensified slightly with each gurgle, as if responding to it or powering it. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a place of sacrifice. This was a place of sustenance. And whatever was being sustained was alive, or at least sentient enough to demand. The Fed wasn't just about offering up bodies. It was about offering up life itself. My life. A new surge of adrenaline fueled by pure terror coursed through me. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't become another offering, another drained husk for whatever monstrosity they served. I started to work at the ropes again, desperate, ignoring the pain. I twisted my wrists, pulled, sawed the rough fibers against each other. My skin was raw, but I barely registered it. Suddenly, a small dark object rolled into one of the puddles on the floor, having fallen from a ledge or a crack I hadn't noticed. It was a shard of obsidian, razor sharp, likely broken off from some tool or ritualistic blade. My heart leaped. It was within reach. I wriggled, inching my bound hands towards it, my body screaming in protest. The cold, fetid water soaked into my clothes. My fingers brushed against the smooth, deadly edge. With painstaking effort, I managed to hook it with my pinky finger, pulling it closer, until I could grasp it clumsily between my bound hands. Now came the delicate part. I had to saw through the ropes without cutting myself too badly. The obsidian was unforgiving. Each movement was slow, deliberate, agonizingly difficult with my hands tied. The sound of the distant chanting and the occasional gurgle from beyond the wall spurred me on. They were feeding it, and soon they would come back for me to finish the process. Minutes stretched into an eternity. My wrists bled, the warm, sticky blood mixing with the cold puddle water. But gradually, gloriously, I felt the fibers of the rope begin to give way, one strand at a time. A few more frantic, desperate pulls, and then with a soft snap, one of the ropes loosened. I tore at it, adrenaline lending me strength, and my hands were free. My fingers, stiff and numb, immediately went to my ankles. The ropes there were easier to manage now that I could use both hands. In less than a minute, I was completely unbound. I scrambled to my feet, my legs wobbly, nearly collapsing. The weakness was still profound, a deep exhaustion that permeated every cell. But the urgency of escape overruled everything else. I moved to the chamber door, if it could even be called that, a heavy stone slab, fitted tightly into the earth. There was no visible handle, no crack, no way to open it from the inside. They had sealed me in. My gaze darted around the small prison. The crack in the wall was my only window to the outside, to whatever horrors lay beyond. I pushed against the wall near the crack, testing the stones. They were solid, unyielding. My heart sank. Was this it? Had I merely bought myself a few more minutes before they returned? Then a thought struck me. The water. It was seeping in, collecting in puddles. Where did it go? It had to drain somewhere, or this chamber would be flooded. I knelt, examining the floor, tracing the path of the water. It seemed to flow towards a lower point, a darker recess that dipped slightly. I ran my hand along the floor, feeling for any irregularity. My fingers hit something. Not a crack, but a faint, almost imperceptible seam in the stone. It ran parallel to the wall, leading into the dark recess. It was incredibly well hidden, almost part of the natural rock. I pushed, prodded, then braced myself and shoved with all my depleted strength. With a grinding groan that echoed deafeningly in the small chamber, a section of the floor, no larger than a small trapdoor, shifted inwards, then pivoted downwards into the darkness. A rush of cold, damp air, smelling even more strongly of stagnant water and that ancient, fetid odor wafted up. Below, I could see nothing but inky blackness. This was it. My only chance. Without hesitation, I lowered myself into the opening, my feet searching for purchase. The descent was steeper than I expected, and my hands scraped against rough stone. I slid, tumbling a short distance, landing with a splash in a shallow, icy stream that flowed through a narrow subterranean tunnel. The water was frigid, biting at my already weakened body. I pushed myself up, shivering violently, and looked back at the opening. It was high above, a faint square of gray light. I was in a natural cavern system, or at least one that had been extensively used and modified. The air here was heavy, oppressive, and the sound of the unseen gurgling entity was much louder, a constant low thrum that vibrated through the rock. I began to move, following the flow of the underground stream. The tunnel was winding, claustrophobic in places, opening into larger, echoing caverns in others. I could hear the distant voices of the river folk, sometimes above me, sometimes seemingly beside me, their chanting rising and falling like a macabre tide. I was deep within their domain, a labyrinth beneath the earth, connected to the river in ways I was only just beginning to comprehend. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a vast, cavernous space. The green light was much stronger here, illuminating the cavern with an eerie, pulsating glow. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. This was where the feeding happened. The cavern was immense, its ceiling lost in shadow. In the center, a huge, natural pool of water, impossibly still and dark, pulsed with that same sickly green light. It wasn't just reflecting the light. The water itself seemed to glow from within, and surrounding it, carved into the rock, were dozens of figures, silent and still. Not statues. Not entirely. They were desiccated, mummified forms, some skeletal, some still retaining a horrifying semblance of human shape, all facing the glowing pool, their empty eyes fixed on its depths. Their flesh, where it remained, was stretched taut, like dry leather, their mouths agape in silent screams. These were the fed. These were the ones who had given their essence to the river, or to whatever ancient horror resided within it. They weren't just dead, they were drained, emptied, their life force, their very souls consumed. And then I saw it. In the center of the glowing pool, just beneath the surface, a colossal amorphous shape stirred. It was immense, a dark mass that absorbed rather than reflected the green light, like a void within the void. It shifted slowly, deliberately, sending ripples across the surface of the green water. It had no discernible form, no eyes, no limbs, just a vast, undulating presence that radiated an ancient, predatory hunger. This was the river. This was what they served. This was what Fet truly meant. And I, Michael, had been destined to join the silent, mummified congregation on the cavern walls. A guttural roar, louder and more terrifying than anything I had heard before, echoed through the cavern, shaking the very foundations of the earth. It wasn't from the entity in the pool, but from the entrance of the cavern, where a torchlight suddenly flared. They had found me. The sudden flare of torchlight blinded me momentarily, but the figures it illuminated were unmistakable. Caleb stood at the front, his face a mask of grim determination, flanked by two other elders I recognized from the community gatherings. Behind them, a larger group of younger men, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and resolve, held more torches, casting long dancing shadows that made the cavern walls seem to writhe. "Michael," Caleb's voice, usually so calm and measured, was a low growl. "You should not be here." My heart hammered against my ribs. I was trapped, caught between the ancient, pulsating horror in the pool and the silent, judging presence of the river folk. The air crackled with a tension so thick I could almost taste it. The entity in the pool, disturbed by the sudden intrusion, seemed to pulse with renewed intensity, its bioluminescent glow flaring brighter, illuminating the viscous surface with an unsettling internal light. It was as if it was reacting to them, not just me. "I know," I managed, my voice hoarse. "I know what you've been doing. Elias, the others, it's all for this." I pointed a trembling finger at the pool, its surface now churning slightly, as if something vast was stirring beneath. Caleb's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking from me to the pool and back. There was no surprise, only a deep, weary acceptance in his expression. "You speak of things you do not understand, boy. This is not for a stranger to meddle with. These are the old ways, the ways that sustain us." "Sustain you?" I scoffed, a desperate courage igniting within me. "By taking lives? By feeding that thing?" One of the younger men stepped forward, his face contorted in anger. "He defiles the sacred place. He sees what is not for mortal eyes." "Silence, Seth," Caleb commanded, holding up a hand. His gaze was fixed on me, a strange mix of sorrow and menace. "Michael, you have seen too much. You have walked where the living should not tread. This cannot stand." The implication hung heavy in the air. They weren't just going to send me away. They were going to ensure their secret remained buried forever. My mind raced, searching for an escape, a way out of this impossible situation. The cavern was a dead end, and the only path back was blocked by the river folk. Just then a low guttural sound, like stones grinding together, emanated from the pool. The entity, whatever it was reacting to the confrontation. The water began to ripple violently, sending small waves lapping against the stone edge. A sickly sweet odor, like decaying flowers and stagnant water, intensified, making my stomach churn. Caleb and the elders exchanged a quick, knowing look. Their expressions shifted from anger to a more primal fear. "It's agitated," one whispered. "We must calm it," Caleb said, his voice now urgent, "before it spills out." "Spill out?" The word sent a fresh wave of terror through me. What would happen if that thing, that ancient, malevolent presence, was unleashed upon the world? Was this what they truly feared? Not just exposure, but the entity itself? "You think you can control it?" I challenged, hoping to buy myself time to distract them. "You think you can keep it contained forever?" Caleb ignored me, his attention now solely on the roiling pool. He began to chant, a low, rhythmic incantation in the riverfolk's ancient tongue, a language I barely understood but recognized as the same one Elias had used in his frantic journal entries. The other elders joined him, their voices weaving into a haunting chorus. As they chanted, the entity in the pool seemed to respond. The ripples grew into swells, and the bioluminescent glow pulsed erratically, casting grotesque, shifting shadows across the cavern. I could see shapes now, indistinct but massive, moving beneath the surface, pushing against the confines of the pool. The air grew colder, and a palpable sense of dread permeated the cavern, pressing down on us all. I looked at the young men behind the elders. Their faces, once resolute, were now pale with fear. They gripped their torches tighter, their eyes wide, fixed on the terrifying spectacle unfolding before them. They were afraid of it just as I was. Perhaps in their fear lay my chance. "It's getting out of control," I shouted, trying to cut through the chanting. "It's going to break free, and it won't just be your secret anymore." My words seemed to pierce through the elders' concentration, if only for a moment. Caleb faltered, his chant breaking. He looked at me, then back at the increasingly violent pool. The entity was pushing harder, the water now frothing, a dark, viscous liquid beginning to slosh over the stone rim. "The seal is weakening," one elder cried. Panic began to ripple through the group of younger men. They started to back away, their torches wavering. This wasn't a ritual they understood, or perhaps it was a ritual gone horribly wrong. Caleb turned to them, his voice booming over the rising din from the pool. "Hold your ground. We must reinforce the barrier. We must not let it escape." But the fear was contagious. The ground beneath us began to tremble, a deep, resonant rumble that shook the very foundation of the cavern. Dust and small pebbles rained down from the ceiling. The entity was not just agitated, it was actively trying to break free. In that moment of chaos, as the elders desperately tried to re-establish their control, and the younger men wavered between obedience and self-preservation, I saw my opportunity. I didn't think, I acted. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, I lunged forward, not towards the exit, but towards the edge of the pool, where a collection of ancient-looking, carved stone tablets lay scattered, evidently part of the ritual setup. I didn't know what they were, but they looked important, an integral part of the seal or the old ways. "Stop him!" Caleb roared, finally snapping his attention back to me. But it was too late. I grabbed the largest tablet I could find, a heavy, obsidian-like slab, etched with symbols that pulsed faintly with a dark energy. It felt cold and alien in my hands. Without hesitation, I hoisted it with all my strength and with a guttural cry, hurled it into the churning, glowing depths of the pool. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A deafening shriek, unlike anything I had ever heard, tore through the cavern. It was a sound of immense pain and fury, originating not from the entity itself, but from the very fabric of the pool. The bioluminescent glow flared blindingly, then instantly dimmed, plunging the cavern into near darkness, save for the flickering torches. The water in the pool erupted upwards, a massive geyser of black, viscous liquid, showering us all. It wasn't water. It was something else, something alive and sickeningly thick. The smell became unbearable, a suffocating stench of decay and ozone. The cavern itself began to groan, the tremors intensifying into a violent earthquake. Cracks spiderwebbed across the ceiling, and immense boulders began to detach, crashing down into the pool and onto the cavern floor. The river folk scattered, their cries of panic echoing mine. "The cavern is collapsing!" Caleb screamed, his face a mask of terror. "Run! Everyone run!" He was no longer worried about me or the secret, only about survival. The entity, whatever it was thrashing wildly, its movements causing the very earth to convulse. My single, desperate act had either shattered its prison or provoked it beyond all control. I didn't wait. Blinded by the spray of black liquid, choking on the putrid air, and deafened by the screams and the roar of falling rock, I turned and ran. I scrambled over falling debris, dodging massive stones that crashed inches from my head. The path I had entered through was now a perilous gauntlet of destruction. I could hear the frantic shouts of the river folk behind me, their calls turning into screams as the cavern continued its terrifying collapse. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My only thought was to get out, to escape the ancient horror I had inadvertently unleashed, or at least severely agitated. I stumbled through the narrow passageway, feeling the ground heave and buckle beneath my feet. The air was thick with dust and the sickening smell. I could hear the distant, monstrous thrashing from the main chamber, accompanied by the sounds of shattering stone and the chilling, inhuman shriek that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I burst out into the cool, damp night air, gasping for breath. I collapsed onto the muddy bank of the river, my lungs burning, my body shaking uncontrollably. Behind me, the entrance to the cavern, once a hidden maw, was now a gaping, crumbling wound in the earth. More rocks tumbled, and with a final earth-shaking roar, the entire cliff face above the entrance buckled and collapsed, burying the cavern, the pool, and whatever remained within, under tons of rock and soil. Silence descended, broken only by the gentle lapping of the river and my own ragged breathing. I lay there for a long time, staring at the scarred earth, the lingering dust motes dancing in the moonlight. The sickening smell of the entity still clung to me, a phantom odor that I knew would haunt my nightmares for years to come. I never saw Caleb or any of the other river folk again. The next morning I walked out of the woods, a ghost of my former self. I told the authorities everything I could about Elias, about the river folk, about the collapsing cavern. They found no trace of the community, no bodies, just a massive rockslide where I said the cavern had been. Skepticism was thick in their voices, but the evidence of a recent large-scale geological event was undeniable. They attributed the disappearance of Elias and the river folk to the landslide, a tragic natural disaster. But I knew the truth. I knew it in the way the air still caught in my throat when I thought of that smell. I knew it in the recurring nightmares of the pulsating glow and the thrashing shapes beneath the surface. I knew it in the chilling, inhuman shriek that sometimes, on the darkest, quietest nights, still echoed in the deepest corners of my mind. The river folk vanished, along with their secrets and their old ways. Or perhaps, they simply became one with the very thing they had sought to appease and contain. I often wonder, did my act of desperation truly destroy the entity, or did it merely seal it away deeper, more dormant, waiting for a new generation to discover its ancient, hungry presence? The river flows on, seemingly peaceful, but I can no longer look at its dark waters without a shiver. I survived, but a part of me remains in that collapsed cavern, forever bound to the terrifying truth of the old ways of the river folk. And sometimes when I'm alone, I imagine I can still hear the river whispering, not with the sound of flowing water, but with the echo of an ancient, hungry groan, stirring just beneath the surface of the world.